You've all heard the story, I'm sure, about the United States Supreme Court, Justice Clarence Thomas. It was published about 6 weeks ago. It turns out that Justice Thomas was receiving lavish gifts from a Texas billionaire named Harlan Crow. Harlan Crow and his family made a lot of money in real estate, other investments, and he is pretty well known because as recently as this last summer, Harlan Crow had been providing transportation for a Supreme Court Justice, Clarence Thomas, and his family. And sadly, the justice failed to disclose that gift as required by law. Mr. President, the highest court in the nation must not have the lowest ethical standards. Sadly, I'm afraid that is the case today. Every federal judge in the United States of America is bound by a code of ethical conduct and a set of ethics rules and enforcement mechanisms. Every single judge in America, except for the 9 across the street in the Supreme Court. It was 11 years ago, in February 2012, when I first wrote Chief Justice Roberts and urged him to address this problem. I urged him to have the Supreme Court adopt a binding code of conduct that applies to all justices, just like every other federal judge in America. He refused. And the ethics problem, which was already swirling around the court a decade ago, has grown progressively worse. The Senate Judiciary Committee, which I chair, is currently seeking information to understand the full extent of the ethical problems in the Supreme Court because of their lack of a binding code of conduct. The committee must engage in this work because Chief Justice Roberts refuses to do what is within his power to do today: adopt a resolution binding the 9 justices to an enforceable code of ethical conduct just like every other federal judge. The polling data on the reputation of the Supreme Court tells a story. It has plummeted. People have lost confidence in a court that is hiding something as basic as this. If people with interests before the court are able to get special private access to any Supreme Court justice through gifts or travel or vacations or giveaways, the American people have a right to know. If the court is going to be credible, it has to be transparent. At a minimum, it creates an appearance of a conflict of interest, if not an actual one. The Senate Judiciary Committee has well-established legislative and oversight authority over the federal judiciary. It's imperative that the committee understand how people and parties with interest before the court are able to gain influence and access to any justice. While we are focused on the ethical conduct of all the justices, the revelations about hundreds of thousands of dollars in undisclosed gifts that Justice Clarence Thomas has received over the past 2 decades present the clearest example of the appearance of misconduct that we must address through legislation. Late last night, Senate Judiciary Committee received a second response from Texas billionaire Harlan Crow to our earlier letters of May 8 and May 26. Those letters were requests for information about the lavish gifts he and 3 companies have provided to Justice Thomas. And sadly, he's made it clear that he refuses to voluntarily cooperate. Harlan Crow has based this refusal on a dangerous, undemocratic argument that information and requests of him about these gifts infringe on the separation of powers between Congress and the court. This argument is baseless. Good news for Harlan Crow. If you check with your lawyers, they will inform you you are not a branch of government. You are a private citizen. You cannot declare that you're standing up for the Supreme Court and refuse to cooperate with Congress, and that's exactly what he's doing. He's not a member of government. He is not a government. He is not a branch of government. He's a rich Texas billionaire that wants friends in high places. The Senate Judiciary Committee has clearly established authority to conduct oversight over the ethical crisis of the court's own making and to legislate as needed to address it. Let me be clear, all options are on the table to acquire information. We need to help restore faith in the conduct of public servants who serve the highest court in the land. Mr. President, I ask consent to enter into the record the latest letter which we received from Harlan Crow through his attorneys.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. There are parts of this letter which I find incredible. We received it late last night. As I mentioned before, Harlan Crow, the Texas billionaire who gave hundreds of thousands of dollars of undisclosed gifts to this Supreme Court justice over a period of 20 years, now refuses to tell us anything about what those gifts involved, how much was spent, who was there, what was this all about. And he says he can't tell us that because we don't have any authority in Congress over that branch of government, the Supreme Court. Well, he's wrong about that. It turns out the ethics laws that we passed in Congress in years gone by have been upheld by other courts and followed by them, but it's only one court in the land that's decided that it won't follow those standards. The highest court in the land has decided that it'll have the lowest ethical standards. It's hard to understand. Here is Harlan Crow, the Texas billionaire, spending all this money on one Supreme Court justice, saying that we cannot in Congress ask hard questions about the ethical standards of the highest court in the land because it would put undue influence on the court. Bottom line, undue influence is what this is all about. No one should be able to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on a senator, a congressman, or certainly a Supreme Court justice without full disclosure and compliance with the law. And for the Supreme Court to say, that's asking too much, I think the American people can draw their own conclusions. They have a right to know. If Harlan Crow thinks that our passing an ethics code for the Supreme Court would put undue influence on the court, how does he explain spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on gift trips, on yachts and chartered airplanes for a Supreme Court justice? Is he not seeking undue influence on the same court? It's obvious that's true. Well, what surprised me after I received this letter, and once again was offended by the logic of it, if there is any, at the end of the day, I looked online today to find that this attorney, Michael Bopp, is saying that he's made an offer now to meet with the staff of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I read the letter for the third time, and I thought, how did I happen to miss that? Well, it turns out it's the final sentence in the letter, and I'd like to read it to you. Please feel free to have your staff contact me with any questions concerning this response and to set up a time to further discuss your request. That, I suppose, is the offer to meet. I'm not going to turn it down. We are going to meet with him if he wishes to discuss this further. But before we go any further in that conversation about this committee, let me make a reference to the bottom line in this controversy. Chief Justice John Roberts, the person that this court is named after, as all Chief Justices are, the Roberts Court, has the authority this afternoon, before 5 o'clock, to announce a resolution and resolve this issue once and forever, to make sure that the court steps away from this sordid affair with the right conclusion, to put a code of ethics and a standard of ethical conduct in place that will bring this court into the same world of reality as the rest of the courts in the United States. The American people need to have confidence in this court, and hiding gifts of hundreds of thousands of dollars, not disclosing them and paying no price when they're finally discovered, is not the way to convince the American people that the court is credible. We're going to continue in the Senate Judiciary Committee to do all that we need to do to get to the bottom of this controversy. The American people have a right to believe in this court as they do in this Congress, and we have to do everything in our power to make sure that happens. Mr. President, I yield the floor.